The descent into the Altmühl Valley had always unsettled Dr. Evelyn Cross. The limestone formations, carved by time and water, carried a silence that felt older than memory itself. Just 3 kilometers from the steep northern bends of the Danube River, the terrain narrowed into a labyrinth of fractured rock and hidden chambers, ideal conditions for prehistoric shelter, but rarely for anything more. For 17 years, Cross had worked these caves. She was an archaeologist at Heidelberg University, trained in stratigraphy and material analysis, not myth or legend. Her career had been built on patience, cataloguing ceramic shards, identifying animal remains, mapping human presence across centuries with careful restraint. Every excavation had reinforced the same conclusion. The region held cultural debris, not revelation. Until that morning, the cave entrance was partially concealed by a collapsed rock shelf, an ancient geological event that had sealed the inner chamber long before written history reached the valley. As Cross maneuvered through the narrow opening, her flashlight swept across rough stone walls, marked only by mineral streaks and erosion scars. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Then the beam caught something that did not belong. It was subtle at first, a texture that reflected light differently from the surrounding rock. Cross knelt, brushing away fine sediment with gloved fingers. The object was wrapped, carefully and deliberately, in layers of linen. Beeswax sealed the edges, hardened into a dark amber crust that suggested extreme age. Her breath slowed. This was not debris. This was concealment. Back at the base camp, Cross documented the find with clinical precision. Under ultraviolet illumination, the linen fibers revealed extensive oxidation. The material had been shielded from air and moisture for centuries. When the wrapping was carefully removed, a rolled parchment emerged, its surface darkened, edges brittle, yet astonishingly intact. Cross's assistant, Daniel Hartmann, joined her as she began imaging the text. Hartmann specialized in ancient Semitic languages. He had trained in Jerusalem and Vienna, and he rarely reacted emotionally to damaged inscriptions or fragmentary manuscripts. But as the ultraviolet scans rendered the ink visible, his posture changed, his face drained of color. The characters were Aramaic, not liturgical shorthand, not later Syriac influence. This was early, formal, disciplined script, precise strokes formed by ink whose composition predated medieval replication techniques. "This isn't possible," Hartmann said quietly, staring at the monitor. "This formulation, it doesn't appear in any catalogue." Cross leaned closer. The opening line was unlike anything either of them had encountered. It was not a genealogy, not a parable, not a theological invocation. It read like a statement of record. In the 30th year of his life, Jeshua spoke to the 12 about the times of return. Cross felt a tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition. The unmistakable sensation that accompanies the collapse of an assumption long held to be unbreakable. This was not devotional writing. This was not prophecy in verse. The structure that followed was analytical. Numbers appeared in the margins, cycles, repeating intervals, references to lunar motion and stellar alignment embedded in declarative sentences. The parchment did not speak in metaphor. It instructed. Cross closed the equipment case and reached for her satellite phone. There was only one person she trusted to see this first. Professor Jonathan Hale, director of the Institute for Biblical Studies in Göttingen. If the parchment was authentic, nothing about its contents belonged in the margins of history, and Cross already knew, without data, without confirmation, that her career had just ended, or begun. Professor Jonathan Hale arrived at the base camp before sunset. He was not a man easily unsettled. As director of the Institute for Biblical Studies in Göttingen, Hale had spent 3 decades navigating disputed manuscripts, apocryphal texts, and claims that dissolved under scrutiny. He trusted process, provenance, and restraint. Nothing else. When Dr. Evelyn Cross handed him the sealed case, he did not open it immediately. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the cave entrance, studying the collapsed geometry, the sediment layers, the angle of the fallen stone. He asked no questions about theology, only about context. How long was the chamber sealed? At least 2,000 years, Cross replied. Possibly longer. Hale nodded once. Only then did he sit, don sterile gloves, and unroll the parchment beneath controlled lighting. He examined the ink first, not the words. Density, penetration, oxidation. His fingers hovered just above the surface, careful never to touch. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Cross and Daniel Hartman remained silent as Hale worked, occasionally switching lenses, occasionally leaning back, as if recalibrating his expectations. The sun sank behind the valley ridge, the cave filled with long shadows. Finally, Hale spoke. This text does not behave like scripture. Cross felt the air shift. Explain, she said. Hale pointed to the margins. These are not annotations added later. They are integral. Numerical sequences recur at fixed intervals. Lunar references correspond to actual synodic cycles, not symbolic numerology. He paused, then added quietly, "Whoever wrote this understood astronomy as a system, not as allegory." Hartman swallowed. "That's not consistent with first-century theological texts." "Exactly," Hale replied. He turned to the opening line again. "In the 30th year of his life?" "There are no known contemporaneous sources," Hale continued, "that frame Jeshua's life this way. The Gospels avoid chronology. This text does the opposite. It anchors time." For the first time, Hale's composure fractured, just slightly. "If this parchment is authentic," he said, "we are not dealing with a lost sermon. We are dealing with a document that should not exist." He requested immediate containment. Within hours, messages were sent through encrypted academic channels. No press. No leaks. Hale insisted on absolute silence until scientific validation was complete. The parchment would undergo carbon-14 dating at the Munich Institute of Technology, ink composition analysis, paleographic verification, independent replication. 3 disciplines, Hale said firmly. No exceptions. Cross agreed. 2 days later, the parchment was transported under security escort to Munich. Dr. Rebecca Nolan, a forensic specialist in ancient manuscripts, received it personally. She worked in a sealed laboratory, isolated from external databases to prevent confirmation bias. Her initial observations were troubling. The linen fibers showed uniform degradation, no artificial aging. The beeswax seal contained organic impurities, consistent with ancient apiculture methods, not modern replication. Microscopic analysis revealed stress fractures formed over centuries, not years. When the first carbon-14 results arrived, Nolan stared at the screen for a long time before printing them. The linen dated between 30 and 90 CE. She ran the test again. Same result. The ink analysis followed. Olive oil soot, gum arabic, iron sulfate, a recipe lost after late antiquity. Under electron microscopy, trace mineral content revealed copper particulates matching deposits from the Araba Valley, mined exclusively during the early Roman period. Nolan contacted Hale directly. "I've checked for every known forgery marker," she said. "There are none." Silence on the line. Then Hale asked the question no academic ever wants to ask. "If it's real," he said slowly, "what exactly are we looking at?" Nolan hesitated. "A technical document," she answered, "from the 1st century, written in Aramaic, describing celestial events with predictive intent." By the end of the week, 7 international teams, archaeologists, physicists, linguists, and historians, were quietly en route to Bavaria. None of them said it aloud, but all of them were thinking the same thing. If the calculations were correct, 2 of the signs described in the parchment had already occurred, and the 3rd was still ahead. While the parchment underwent physical testing in Munich, a parallel investigation began hundreds of kilometers away at the University of Tübingen. Professor Andrew Meyer, one of Europe's leading paleographers, received high-resolution scans under strict confidentiality. He was not told where the document had been found, only when it was believed to originate. That was intentional. Meyer's specialty was deception, not in the moral sense, but in the scientific one. He had spent his career identifying forgeries that fooled entire institutions. Ink could be imitated, materials could be aged, but language, he often said, was the hardest thing to fake over long distances of time. He began where all paleographers do: letter forms. The Aramaic script displayed an early Galilean hand, angular but restrained, with consistent stroke pressure. Certain phonetic markers appeared that were known to vanish after 70 CE, following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. Others had not yet fully standardized, placing the writing before later rabbinic normalization. Meyer leaned back in his chair. "These forms," he muttered, "are transitional." He moved on to syntax. The sentence structure was neither poetic nor liturgical. It followed a declarative, instructional rhythm, clauses built upon each other logically, often referencing earlier statements. This was not oral tradition transcribed later. It was composed as text. Most unsettling were the technical terms. The parchment used precise astronomical vocabulary, terms that appeared nowhere else in surviving first-century Jewish writings. Yet they were not anachronistic. They were correct, perfectly calibrated to the conceptual limits of the era. Except for one detail, the author treated celestial motion as predictable, not divinely spontaneous, not symbolic. Predictable. Meyer compiled his findings into a 40-page report, attaching annotated diagrams and probability assessments. When he finished, he sent a single line to Professor Jonathan Hale. Forgery probability. Statistically negligible. Hale read the report twice. Then he forwarded it to Dr. Evelyn Cross with no commentary. At the same time, translation work intensified. In a monastery in the Eifel region, Father Elias Demetriou continued rendering the Aramaic text into modern analytical language. He was chosen not only for his theological training, but for his background in classical mathematics, a rarity among clergy. As Demetriou worked, patterns emerged. The parchment was not structured as a single discourse. It was divided into sections, each corresponding to a distinct celestial configuration. The language shifted subtly when calculations appeared, as if the author were guiding the reader step by step. One passage stopped Demetriou cold. It described Jeshua kneeling in sand, tracing circles with his finger. 3 concentric paths, 3 moving lights. The text emphasized not belief, but observation. "The heavens do not speak," the line read. "They demonstrate." Demetriou closed his notebook and stared at the wall for several minutes. He had devoted his life to interpreting doctrine. But this text resisted doctrine entirely. It asked for verification. On April 12th, he reached out to Dr. Aaron Locke at the Max Planck Institute in Garching. Locke was known in academic circles for one thing: skepticism. He had publicly dismantled claims of ancient astronomical foresight more than once. When Demetriou requested a meeting, Locke almost declined. Almost. "I'll look," Locke said over the phone. "But I won't indulge mythology." "That's all I'm asking," Demetriou replied. The following morning, they met in Locke's office overlooking the Munich gravel plains. No cameras, no assistants, just data. Demetriou laid out the translations, the diagrams, the described events. 3 planetary conjunctions, he said, each tied to specific constellations, each visible from the Near East. Locke scanned the pages, unimpressed. "These descriptions are vague," he said. "Poetic." Demetriou pointed to the margins. "These numbers aren't." Locke frowned. The margin notes contained angular separations, visibility durations, dawn versus dusk markers, constraints that eliminated randomness. Without a word, Locke turned to his computer. He accessed simulation software developed by the German Aerospace Center, capable of reconstructing planetary positions thousands of years into the past and future. "Let's start simple," he said. "If this text is fiction, it will fail immediately." He entered the first set of parameters. The screen refreshed. Locke did not speak. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not belief. Recognition. Dr. Aaron Locke stared at the screen longer than he intended to. The simulation had finished rendering. The planetary positions were displayed against a star field, calibrated to ancient skies. No modern constellations, no visual aids, just raw positional data translated into light. Locke cleared his throat. "Let's be precise," he said, more to himself than to Father Elias Demetriou. "We're looking for conjunctions visible from Central Europe and the Near East. Angular separation under 2 degrees. Time frame, modern era first." He adjusted the parameters, refining visibility thresholds and atmospheric extinction. If the parchment was merely poetic coincidence, these constraints would eliminate any false positives. The software recalculated. A date appeared. August 31st, 1987. Locke leaned forward. "Venus and Jupiter," he said slowly. "The 2 brightest planets in the night sky." Demetriou remained silent. "They converge in Leo," Locke continued, zooming in, "near Regulus, the Alpha star, traditionally known as the heart of the lion." He paused, then read from the translation. "When the 2 shining wanderers meet in the heart of the lion." Locke exhaled sharply. "Separation, 0.8 degrees, he added. "For 3 consecutive nights, they would have appeared as a single star, extremely rare." Demetriou nodded once. "Coincidence," Locke said quickly. "One event means nothing." He input the second set of parameters. Mars, Venus, constellation, Aquarius. The computation finished in seconds. June 17th, 2003. Locke froze. "Mars and Venus," he whispered. "Red and white, separated by 1.2 degrees. Visible at dawn. Duration, 5 days." He did not need to consult the parchment this time. The language echoed in his mind. "When the red and the white dance in the waters of the bearer." The room felt smaller. Locke pushed back from the desk and stood, pacing once, then twice. He stopped by the window, staring out at the flat expanse of the Munich gravel plains, as if grounding himself in the present might restore distance from what he was seeing. "2 matches," he said finally. "That's improbable, but still not impossible." Demetriou said nothing. Locke returned to the desk and picked up the final translated page. The 3rd description was different. It referenced not 2, but 3 celestial bodies. It spoke of dawn, of horizon alignment, of a configuration tied explicitly to birth and return. When the 3 wise ones meet again at the horizon of dawn in the house of the ram, as they did when the king was born. Locke read the line twice. "This is problematic," he said. "Most Bethlehem star theories place the event in Pisces, not Aries." "Then the theories are wrong," Demetrio replied quietly. Locke hesitated, then turned back to the computer. "If there was a triple conjunction in Aries near the traditional birth period," he said, "it would rewrite half a century of astronomical debate." He ran the simulation backward. The system processed centuries of orbital data. A date emerged. April 20th, 6 BCE. Locke's hands went still on the keyboard. "Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars," he said. "All in Aries, triangular configuration, angular separation under 5 degrees, visible at dawn." He sank into his chair. "No mainstream model accounts for this," he murmured. "Because no one thought to look here." Demetrio spoke for the first time in several minutes. "And the return?" Locke swallowed. He switched the simulation forward. The computation took longer this time, processing thousands of future planetary alignments. Then the screen changed. A single date appeared, stark and unadorned. March 27th. Locke felt his skepticism collapse, not into belief, but into something far more dangerous for a scientist: uncertainty. Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, he said softly. Aries, dawn sky. Maximum separation 6.4 degrees. He looked up at Demetrio. "If this is coincidence," Locke said, "it's the most precise coincidence I've ever seen." Outside, the sky was clear, and for the first time Locke wondered, not whether the heavens could be calculated, but who had done the calculating. The room remained silent long after the final date appeared on the screen. Dr. Aaron Locke stared at March 27th as if it might dissolve if he refused to acknowledge it. For most of his career, he had operated under a simple principle: extraordinary claims fail under precision. They collapse when constrained by mathematics. This one had survived. Locke leaned back, pressing his fingers against his temples. "We need to establish something immediately," he said. "The software is not interpreting symbolism. It's reconstructing orbital mechanics. These results are not opinions." Father Elias Demetrio nodded. "That's why the text avoids metaphor once the calculations begin." Locke glanced at him. "Which is exactly what troubles me." He reopened the data logs, verifying input parameters line by line: visibility thresholds, atmospheric refraction, ancient horizon models adjusted for axial precession. Every safeguard was in place. The alignments remained. "2 of the 3 events have already occurred," Locke said slowly. 1987, 2003. "And the 3rd? Demetrio asked. Locke did not answer immediately. "It hasn't happened yet," he said at last, "but it will." The implications settled heavily between them. If the parchment described 3 events, 2 in the recent past, 1 in the near future, then it was not prophecy in the traditional sense. It was a schedule. Locke closed the simulation software and turned back to the translations. "Whoever authored this," he said, "wasn't guessing. These aren't broad predictions that can be retrofitted after the fact. The angular constraints alone eliminate most random alignments." Demetrio lowered his voice. "Then the question becomes how." Locke exhaled. "Exactly." Within 48 hours, Hale convened a secure meeting in Bavaria. Representatives from archaeology, astrophysics, paleography, and theology gathered in a windowless conference room. No media, no recordings. Notes were handwritten and collected afterward. Dr. Evelyn Cross presented the archaeological context: sealed chamber, no intrusion markers, no secondary artifacts. The parchment had been deliberately hidden, not discarded. Dr. Rebecca Nolan summarized the material analysis: authentic linen, period-correct ink, no trace of modern contamination. Professor Andrew Meyer delivered the linguistic verdict. Statistically unfakeable. Then Locke stood. He displayed the simulations, the alignments, the dates, the constraints. "This is not pattern-seeking," he said firmly. "This is orbital mechanics. If the parchment were wrong, it would fail immediately. It doesn't." A physicist from Zurich raised a hand. Could this be selective reporting? Thousands of conjunctions occur. Locke nodded. Yes, but not under these constraints. Visibility, brightness, constellation specificity, dawn timing. The probability of 3 such matches by chance is extremely low. "How low?" someone asked. Locke hesitated, then answered. "Under 0.1%. Silence followed. Then Hale spoke. "If this text was written in the 1st century," he said, "then whoever composed it understood celestial motion well enough to predict events 2,000 years into the future." The room shifted uneasily. "That level of foresight doesn't exist in the historical record," said another voice. "Not until Copernicus. Not until Kepler." "And yet," Cross said quietly, "here it is." By the end of the meeting, a consensus emerged, not on interpretation, but on fact. The parchment was real. The astronomy was real. The implications were unresolved. A containment strategy was agreed upon, limited disclosure, peer-reviewed validation before public release. Time to understand what they were dealing with. They would not get it. 3 days later, a leak occurred. A single line, anonymous, appeared on a European academic forum. Ancient manuscript predicts modern planetary alignments with impossible accuracy. By morning, the post had been archived, copied, and shared. By noon, journalists were calling Heidelberg University. By evening, Dr. Evelyn Cross's phone would not stop ringing. The story had escaped, and with it, the timeline. Somewhere beyond institutional walls and scholarly caution, March 27th was no longer a data point. It was a date. The first article appeared on a regional science blog before dawn. It was cautious in tone, speculative in language, and sourced anonymously. But it contained just enough detail to be dangerous. An ancient manuscript, authenticated by multiple disciplines, describing planetary alignments with modern accuracy. By midday, the restraint was gone. International outlets picked up the story and sharpened it. Headlines spoke of lost texts, forbidden calculations, and a timetable of return. Within hours, the narrative escaped academia entirely. It entered the public imagination, where nuance does not survive. Dr. Evelyn Cross watched the transformation with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Her inbox filled faster than she could read it. Universities, television producers, religious institutions, private donors, governments, everyone wanted access. At Heidelberg University, administrators convened emergency meetings. Press offices drafted statements designed to say everything and nothing at once. No denial, no confirmation, just calls for patience. It didn't matter. On social media, amateur astronomers began replicating Dr. Aaron Locke's simulations using open-source software. The results matched. Forums lit up with screenshots. Reddit threads ballooned into the thousands of comments. 2 alignments confirmed, 1 pending. On April 24th, the Vatican released an official statement. Cardinal Matthew Reynolds, speaking on behalf of the Holy See, acknowledged the discovery and announced the formation of a theological commission. He emphasized caution, discernment, and the dangers of premature interpretation. Privately, the response was anything but calm. Within the Apostolic Palace, Cardinal Antonio Ferris drafted a confidential memorandum to Pope Francis. It circulated among a handful of senior advisors before being locked away. If authentic, Ferris wrote, this document challenges our understanding of eschatology. Christ's words, "No one knows the day or the hour," stand in tension with a text that provides calculable indicators. The risk is not heresy, but reinterpretation. The Commission's mandate was intentionally vague. Study the manuscript, assess doctrinal implications, prepare for uncertainty. Outside Vatican walls, uncertainty had already taken hold. In Berlin, Dr. Samuel Chen published an analysis that went viral within hours. His conclusion was measured, but his implications were explosive. "The most disturbing element," he wrote, "is not predictive astronomy. It is the portrayal of Jeshua as scientifically literate, capable of systematic calculation. This contradicts centuries of theological framing." The comment sections erupted. Believers accused Chen of reductionism. Skeptics accused him of restraint. Both sides shared the article. By early May, the story crossed into popular culture. National Geographic announced a documentary project. Streaming platforms inquired about adaptation rights. A major studio offered to purchase exclusive access to the parchment images. Cross refused them all. She insisted on one thing: peer review first. But peer review takes time, and time was the one variable the story did not have, because now the public was no longer asking whether the parchment was real. They were asking what would happen on March 27th. Astrology apps began highlighting the date. Religious groups announced vigils. Conspiracy forums filled with speculation. Every sunrise was dissected for omens. Amid the noise, Dr. Aaron Locke retreated into data. He recalculated everything, adjusted assumptions, challenged inputs. He needed to break the model. It would not break. Late one night, Locke sent a message to Cross. "This isn't prediction," he wrote. "It's comprehension." Someone understood the system. Cross read the message twice. If that was true, then the question facing them was no longer theological. It was historical. Who, in the 1st century, possessed knowledge that would not be rediscovered for nearly 1,500 years? And why had they chosen to hide it, waiting for a future that had finally arrived? As public attention intensified, the academic response grew more deliberate. What had begun as crisis management now shifted into historical excavation, not of earth, but of memory. Dr. Evelyn Cross authorized a parallel archival search. If the parchment had been deliberately concealed, then traces of its existence might have survived elsewhere. References, allusions, marginal notes dismissed by generations as anomalies. They began with monastic records. In the Eifel, the ground-penetrating radar arrived at dawn. It was transported without markings, unloaded without ceremony, and assembled inside the cave under portable lighting. Dr. Evelyn Cross insisted on minimal personnel. No press, no observers. Just a small technical team and silence. The device hummed softly as it calibrated. Cross watched the screen as the first scan lines appeared. Horizontal strata, familiar patterns of sediment and voids. The ancient rockfall showed exactly what they expected. A chaotic mass of collapsed limestone sealing the inner chamber. Then the anomaly appeared. 2 meters below the cave floor, the signal returned a shape that did not belong to geology. Flat edges, regular angles, a hollow space. Cross felt her pulse quicken. They marked the coordinates and began excavation by hand. No drills, no heavy tools. Every centimeter of soil was removed slowly, logged, photographed. It took 6 hours. When the stone lid emerged, it was unmistakable. A chamber, sealed with fitted slabs, their joints packed with mineralized sediment. The seal had not been disturbed since antiquity. Cross removed her helmet and sat back on her heels. "Open it," she said. Inside was a chest, charred cedar wood, blackened but intact, sealed with hardened bitumen. The lid resisted at first, then yielded with a sound like old breath escaping confinement. The contents were arranged deliberately. 3 objects. The first was a smaller parchment, wrapped separately, its linen thinner but equally well preserved. The second was a bronze disc, 12 centimeters in diameter, etched with concentric symbols and angular markings unfamiliar to any of the archaeologists present. The third object stopped everyone in the chamber. An astrolabe. Cross did not touch it. She stared. Astrolabes were not unknown in antiquity, but this one was different. Its construction was refined. Adjustable plates, calibrations that suggested corrections for orbital irregularities. "This doesn't belong here," whispered one of the technicians. Cross agreed. The objects were transported to secure facilities under the same protocols used for the original parchment. Specialists were notified. At the British Museum, Professor Richard Hayes examined the astrolabe under magnification. His assessment was immediate and unequivocal. "This instrument originates in the 1st century," he said, "but its sophistication matches 9th century Islamic designs. It includes corrections for Earth's orbital eccentricity, something not formally recognized until much later." He paused. "It's as if multiple generations refined the same instrument over time." The second parchment proved no less unsettling. Dr. Karim al-Rashid identified its contents instantly. Numerical tables written in the Babylonian sexagesimal system, ephemerides. Planetary position tables. The values corresponded to actual planetary locations between 30 and 100 CE, with an error margin under 2%. "These are not symbolic," al-Rashid said. "They are observational records. Someone was tracking the sky systematically." The bronze disc provided the final piece. At its center, an inscription read, "The Watchers of the Appointed Time." Beneath it, "What is written in the heavens cannot be erased." Cross felt a chill settle into her bones. This was not the work of a lone teacher. It was the product of a network. Observers, calculators, preservers. A tradition of astronomical study operating quietly alongside early religious movements. And at its center, whether symbolically or directly, stood Jeshua. The implications rippled outward. The parchment was not a prophecy. It was a message from a system that understood time. As word of the discovery remained contained, for now, Cross looked again at the astrolabe resting beneath protective glass. "Who were you?" she whispered. The instrument, indifferent to the question, reflected only one thing: light. The phrase etched into the bronze disc spread quietly through the research team, the watchers of the appointed time. No one recognized it from canonical scripture. It did not appear in Apocrypha, nor in known sectarian texts. And yet, it felt deliberate, formal, almost institutional. Dr. Evelyn Cross convened a closed session in Bavaria. The astrolabe, the second parchment, and the bronze disc were displayed side by side under controlled lighting. For the first time, the full scope of the find could be considered as a single system rather than isolated anomalies. "This wasn't accidental," Cross said. "You don't build ephemerides without continuity. You don't refine an astrolabe without inheritance." Professor Andrew Meyer agreed. "The language supports it. The main parchment reads like instruction, but the tables read like maintenance." Maintenance of knowledge. Dr. Karim al-Rashid projected comparative charts on the screen. "These ephemerides are too accurate for casual observation. Whoever compiled them had access to long-term data, decades at minimum, possibly generations." A historian from Vienna raised a question. "Are we talking about a hidden sect?" "Not hidden," Meyer replied. obscured. The discussion turned to known first-century groups: Essenes, Zealots, early Judean philosophers. None fit cleanly. The Watchers showed no ritual language, no purity laws, no political agenda. Their focus was singular: observation. The second parchment offered more clues. Between numerical tables were short annotations, brief, unemotional notes marking corrections, discrepancies, refinements. One line appeared repeatedly, adjusted after the third winter. Another read, confirmed by 2 stations. Stations, plural. Cross felt the implication settle in her chest. This wasn't one cave or one teacher. It was a network. Al-Rashid leaned forward. If these observers were active across regions, it would explain the precision. Longitude errors average out when observations are shared. Which means communication, someone added. Coordination. Which means secrecy, Hale said quietly. The room fell still. Secrecy in the 1st century was not trivial. Maintaining a distributed observational network under Roman oversight required discretion, discipline, and motivation beyond curiosity. And Jeshua? Cross asked. Where does he fit? Demetriou spoke softly. The parchment doesn't present him as the founder. It presents him as the interpreter. That distinction mattered. The Watchers may have existed before him. He may have understood their system and given it meaning. Outside academia, pressure mounted. The Israel Museum formally requested temporary custody of the artifacts for public display. Cross refused, citing incomplete analysis. Religious organizations petitioned for access. Governments asked questions disguised as offers of protection. Meanwhile, independent astronomers confirmed Al-Rashid's probability estimates. Less than 0.03% chance of coincidence. Online, a new term began circulating: chronological literacy. The idea that ancient cultures may have understood time not as myth or fate, but as a system, legible, patterned, readable. Locke sent Cross a message late one night. If the Watchers existed, he wrote, they weren't predicting the future, they were mapping it. Cross stared at the words. Mapping required patience. It required humility. It required the acceptance that understanding might outlive the observer. She looked again at the bronze disk. What is written in the heavens cannot be erased. Perhaps the Watchers never intended revelation. Perhaps they only intended preservation. And perhaps the message was not about a return at all, but about humanity's readiness to notice when cycles repeat. As the scope of the discovery expanded, the scientific community reached a threshold it had not prepared for. The question was no longer whether the artifacts were authentic. That debate had effectively ended. The question was what to do with knowledge that did not fit inside existing timelines. At Heidelberg University, an emergency symposium was scheduled under the pretext of an interdisciplinary workshop. 200 scholars from 43 countries attended: astrophysicists, historians, philosophers of science, theologians. The agenda avoided conclusions. It focused on data. Dr. Aaron Locke opened with a presentation stripped of narrative. No mention of Jeshua, no speculation, only orbital mechanics. These configurations are not extraordinary individually, he said. What is extraordinary is their constraint alignment, brightness, angular separation, visibility window, constellation specificity, and historical context. He paused, letting the graph settle. If these parameters are correct, and they are, then whoever authored the system possessed a functional understanding of celestial periodicity far beyond what we attribute to the 1st century. A physicist from Tokyo raised an objection. Could this knowledge have been imported? Babylonian astronomy was advanced. Locke nodded. Yes. But Babylonian astronomy did not model predictive conjunction cycles at this level of precision. Nor did it integrate observational correction loops like the ones we see in the ephemerides. Another voice followed. Could later knowledge have been retroactively attributed? Professor Andrew Meyer answered. No. The paleography forbids it. The language is original, not copied. By midday, the discussion had shifted from denial to discomfort. A philosopher from Paris framed the problem differently. Science assumes progress is linear, she said. This discovery suggests recursion. Knowledge gained, lost, and regained. The word lingered. Recursion. During a closed afternoon session, Dr. Evelyn Cross presented the cave data, the stratigraphy, the seal integrity, the absence of intrusion. These objects were not hidden to avoid discovery, she said. They were hidden to wait. That night, the symposium fractured into private conversations. Some scholars expressed awe, others fear, a few anger. This undermined centuries of intellectual narrative, one historian muttered. If this is true, what else did we miss? The next morning, a joint statement was drafted, carefully worded, non-committal. The artifacts demonstrate an anomalously advanced level of astronomical observation for their era. Further study is required. But outside the conference hall, the world had moved on. News outlets simplified. Social media polarized. The phrase "return timeline" trended globally. In response, Dr. Samuel Chen published a second paper, shorter, sharper. Whether one interprets this through faith or skepticism, he wrote, we are confronting evidence that ancient observers treated the universe as legible. They assumed order, not chaos. That assumption resonated. Astronomy clubs saw record enrollment. Universities reported spikes in astrophysics applications. Public observatories extended hours. People looked up. Quietly, without announcement, NASA and the European Space Agency began cross-referencing the parchment's descriptions against their own databases. Not to validate theology, but to ensure nothing had been overlooked. In Jerusalem, preparations intensified. Observation platforms were installed on rooftops and hillsides. Not official, not coordinated. Just human. Late one evening, Cross received a message from Locke. There's something else, he wrote, a secondary pattern. It's subtle. I'm not sure yet. Cross replied immediately. Show me when you're sure. She set the phone down and looked at the astrolabe again. The instrument that should not exist. The calculations that waited centuries to be read. If the watchers had anticipated confusion, they had planned well. If they had anticipated fear, less so. But if they had anticipated one thing above all, it was this moment, when humanity would be forced to decide whether understanding the heavens was merely an academic pursuit or a responsibility. Dr. Aaron Locke had not slept in nearly 30 hours. The realization had arrived quietly, the way meaningful insights often do, not as revelation, but as irritation. A residual inconsistency, a pattern that refused to disappear. The three major alignments were correct. That much was settled. But when Locke overlaid additional variables, minor planetary motions, lunar interference, background stellar drift, he noticed something else. A rhythm. Not tied to individual conjunctions, but to the intervals between them. Locke reran the simulations, this time isolating temporal spacing rather than spatial alignment. The software returned a sequence of numbers that looked meaningless at first. But when normalized against synodic cycles, the noise vanished. What remained was a repeating structure. 18, Locke whispered. It's 18. He checked again. 18 years between secondary markers. Not the primary conjunctions themselves, but confirmatory events. less obvious alignments that would only be noticed by someone already watching carefully. He cross-referenced the parchment. In the margins, nearly invisible without magnification, were symbols that had previously been dismissed as scribal marks. Locke overlaid them digitally with the simulation output. They matched. Locke's hands shook, not with fear, but with professional shock. This was not just predictive astronomy, it was redundancy engineering. The Watchers had built verification into the system. If the primary signs were doubted, the secondary ones would confirm them, quietly, patiently, every 18 years. A failsafe against disbelief. Locke contacted Dr. Evelyn Cross immediately. "You need to see this," he said, "and you need to bring Demetrio." They met in a secured analysis room outside Munich. Locke projected the data without preamble. "These aren't coincidences," he said. "They're checkpoints. The system anticipates skepticism." Demetrio leaned closer. "Then it wasn't meant for faith." "No," Locke replied. "It was meant for verification." Cross stared at the screen. "Which means whoever designed this assumed future observers would question it." "And prepared for that," Locke said. Demetrio turned back to the parchment. "There is a line we translated loosely. I think we misunderstood it." He read aloud. "Before the final meeting, the King of the Wanderers will display his witnesses in ordered procession, visible only to those who look with trained eyes." Locke swallowed. "Jupiter," he said. "King of the gods. King of the Wanderers." "And the witnesses?" Cross asked. Locke pulled up observational logs. "Jupiter's 4 Galilean moons," he said. "They align in near-linear formation only once every 18 years. Silence filled the room. The last such alignment had occurred in the late 20th century. The next, Locke typed. "May 2027, he said. 2 months after the March 2026 conjunction. Demetrio exhaled slowly. "So even after the 3rd sign," he said, "there is a confirmation." "For those still watching," Locke replied. Cross sat back, absorbing the implication. This was no dramatic proclamation, no singular moment meant to overwhelm. It was a system designed for continuity, a message that could survive doubt. Outside the research bubble, the world continued to polarize. Some dismissed the discoveries as coincidence, others as blasphemy, a few as destiny. But the Watchers had accounted for that too. They did not demand belief, they demanded attention. Cross closed the meeting with a single instruction. "We don't announce this yet," she said. "If we do, it becomes spectacle." Demetrio nodded. "And if we don't?" "Then it remains what it always was," Cross said. "A test of observation." That night, Locke returned to his office and stared at the sky through his window. For the first time in his life, he did not feel small beneath it. He felt addressed. By late summer, the world had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a low, persistent awareness, an undercurrent of anticipation that never quite surfaced, yet never disappeared. March 27th lingered in public consciousness like a distant horizon. Visible, unavoidable, undefined. Within the research circle, discipline tightened. Dr. Evelyn Cross restricted access to the secondary findings, the 18-year verification cycle, the Galilean moons, the redundancy built into the system. None of it was released publicly. "Not yet. The moment we name it," she said during a closed briefing, "we turn it into belief or disbelief. Both are distortions. Instead, they focused on integration. At the Vatican Observatory, astronomers quietly recalibrated equipment. No press releases, no statements, just extended observation windows and upgraded tracking software. In Rome, theologians debated language, not doctrine. how to speak about uncertainty without inflaming it. At the European Space Agency, a small internal task group cross-checked historical sky reconstructions against the parchment's framework. Their conclusion mirrored Locke's, though it was never formally published. The system was internally consistent. In Jerusalem, something subtler occurred. Observation groups formed organically. They were not coordinated by institutions or movements. They emerged from shared curiosity, amateur astronomers, physicists on sabbatical, clergy who knew their constellations, students with nothing but apps and patience. They gathered on rooftops, hillsides, and open courtyards, not to wait for signs, but to watch. Father Elias Demetrio traveled quietly between monasteries, revisiting the 6th century codex that had first hinted at the Watcher's continuity. He noticed something new in the margins, notations added by later hands. Each generation had copied the text, Demetrio realized, but none had altered it. They had treated it as fixed, sacred, not because it commanded belief, but because it demanded restraint. Meanwhile, Dr. Aaron Locke continued refining the simulations. He noticed that the parchment never once described the effect of the alignments, only their occurrence. No promises, no catastrophes, no miracles, just presence. Locke began to understand why the Watchers had avoided spectacle. Prediction invites manipulation. Observation invites humility. Cross received reports from colleagues across disciplines. Sociology departments noted a rise in public science engagement. Philosophy courses filled unexpectedly. Religious attendance remained stable, but sermons shifted tone. Less certainty, more reflection. By early 2026, the language of return had softened in serious circles. Scholars spoke, instead of convergence, of systems aligning, not entities descending. On a clear winter night, Cross stood outside her Heidelberg office and looked up. The stars were indifferent, as they had always been. But her relationship to them had changed. She no longer saw them as background. She saw them as record. The Watchers had not sought to control the future. They had trusted it. Trusted that someone, someday, would be ready to read what was written plainly above them. As March approached, official silence deepened. No announcements, no countdowns, no confirmations, only preparation. And on the final page of the smaller parchment, one Cross had reread dozens of times, there was a line that now felt less cryptic than it once had. Understanding does not arrive with thunder. It arrives when noise fades. The world was still loud, but somewhere, quietly, people were learning how to listen. The final week before March 27th, 2026, passed without incident. No omens, no anomalies, no disruptions to the ordinary rhythms of the world. And yet, nothing felt ordinary. Across continents, people adjusted their schedules without quite knowing why. Observatories extended hours, universities postponed minor exams, airlines quietly added flights to Jerusalem, Amman, and southern Europe. None of it coordinated, all of it convergent. Dr. Evelyn Cross arrived in Jerusalem 3 days early. She did not announce her presence. She did not bring cameras or statements. She stayed in a modest apartment overlooking the old city, close enough to hear the city breathe at night. From her balcony, she could see rooftops dotted with small telescopes, unofficial, improvised, patient. No banners, no chants, just people watching the sky as if it mattered in a way it had not before. At the Vatican Observatory, Father Elias Demetrio worked through the night. He reread the parchment one last time, searching not for new meaning, but for restraint. The Watchers had never warned. They had never promised. They had simply marked time. In Munich, Dr. Aaron Locke ran the simulation one final time. not because he doubted it, but because ritual has value even in science. The planets aligned exactly as predicted. No deviation, no surprise. "See you at dawn," he messaged Cross. She replied with a single word: watching. In Jerusalem, religious authorities issued a joint statement urging calm. It was brief, neutral, almost philosophical. "Observation is not expectation," it read. "Let the sky be what it is." The city listened, more than expected. As night deepened, the air cooled. The usual traffic noise softened. Streets emptied earlier than usual. On the Mount of Olives, hundreds gathered, not in masses, but in clusters. Astronomers stood beside monks, students beside elders. No one spoke loudly. The sky was clear. That alone felt significant. Cross joined a small group on a rooftop near the old walls. She recognized no one. That felt right. The watchers, she thought, would have approved. At 4:42 a.m., the horizon began to pale. The stars did not disappear at once. They receded gradually, reluctantly, as if aware they were being watched. Then it happened. Low on the eastern horizon, 3 points of light emerged. Not dramatic, not radiant, but unmistakably aligned. Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, forming a near-perfect triangle in Aries. The configuration was subtle. Anyone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. No streaks, no flashes, just geometry. Cross felt her breath catch, not in awe, but in recognition. "This is it," someone whispered. No one replied. The triangle held steady as the sky brightened. For several minutes, the planets remained visible, defying the encroaching light. Then, one by one, they faded, not vanishing, but yielding. The sun rose. Nothing else happened. No sound, no vision, no transformation of the world. And yet, Cross sensed it immediately. Something had completed. Not an arrival. A confirmation. She looked around. No one cheered. No one prayed aloud. Some people smiled faintly. Others wiped their eyes without knowing why. Locke's message arrived seconds later. It matched. Exactly. Cross closed her eyes. The watchers had been right. Understanding did not arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly, shared among those who had chosen to look up together. By mid-morning, the city had returned to itself. Cafes opened, buses ran, vendors arranged their stalls beneath the same stone arches that had stood for centuries. For most people, March 27th passed like any other date, filed away as a curiosity, a headline, a rumor that never quite became an event. But for those who had watched, the absence of spectacle was the message. Dr. Evelyn Cross spent the day walking the city alone. She passed through markets and quiet courtyards, listening not for commentary but for tone. There was no panic, no disappointment, just a faint, collective exhale, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. In Munich, Dr. Aaron Locke compiled his final report. He titled it simply, "Observed Convergence." No metaphors, no speculation, just timestamps, coordinates, and confirmation that the planetary geometry had unfolded exactly as calculated. He appended a single sentence at the end, one he debated, including, "The system demonstrates intentional design oriented toward future verification." He left it in. At the Vatican, the commission convened behind closed doors. Theologians spoke less than they had weeks earlier. There was nothing to debate in the sky. It had done precisely what it was expected to do, and nothing more. One senior member summarized the mood quietly. "Revelation did not descend," he said. "Responsibility did." Across academic networks, responses diverged. Some declared the entire episode anticlimactic. Others framed it as confirmation bias. But a third group, small, growing, attentive, began asking different questions. If ancient observers had possessed this level of astronomical understanding, if they had built systems meant to last millennia, what else had been lost? Father Elias Demetriou returned to the 6th century codex one final time. He noticed something he had overlooked before, not in the text, but in its structure. Each generation had copied the work with meticulous care, yet had resisted interpretation. They had been caretakers, not commentators. Demetriou closed the manuscript and understood why. The Watchers had never sought followers. They had sought continuity. In the weeks that followed, cooperation replaced controversy. The Vatican Observatory and Heidelberg University announced a joint research initiative, not theological, but historical and astronomical. Other institutions followed. The artifacts were placed on display at the Israel Museum, accompanied not by proclamations, but by questions. Visitors stood silently before the astrolabe and the bronze disc, reading the inscription again and again. What is written in the heavens cannot be erased. Children asked why the planets mattered. Parents admitted they didn't know. Guides resisted the urge to explain too much. In her Heidelberg office, Cross pinned a photograph to the wall. It showed the horizon at dawn. 3 faint points of light, barely visible, easily missed. She wrote beneath it a line from the smaller parchment. The sign is not the sky. The sign is the act of looking. The world had not changed overnight, but something subtler had begun. People looked up more often. They listened more carefully. They argued less about certainty and more about meaning. The Watchers had not returned. They had never left. They had simply waited, for eyes willing to see patterns without demanding conclusions, for minds willing to hold knowledge without turning it into noise. In the days following the convergence, the loudest reaction was absence. There were no mass gatherings demanding explanation, no global addresses, no declarations of fulfillment. For a brief moment, the world seemed unsure how to respond to something that refused to perform. That uncertainty unsettled many. News cycles struggled. Commentators searched for language strong enough to carry significance without evidence of consequence. Some labeled the event a failure, an anticlimax. Others dismissed it entirely as coincidence, amplified by expectation. But among those closest to the research, the silence felt intentional. Dr. Evelyn Cross returned to Heidelberg with a sense of quiet resolution. The Watchers system had completed its function exactly as designed. Nothing more, nothing less. The temptation to interpret was strong, but she resisted it. Interpretation, she understood now, was not the goal. At a private debriefing, Dr. Aaron Locke addressed a small group of colleagues. "We keep asking what happened," he said. "That's the wrong framework. Nothing was supposed to happen." Several heads turned. "The system wasn't designed to cause an event," Locke continued. "It was designed to confirm understanding. The alignment wasn't the message. It was the checksum." That metaphor stayed with them. A checksum does not add information. It verifies integrity. Father Elias Demetriou framed it differently. In a letter circulated quietly among theologians, he wrote, "If revelation demands spectacle, it competes with fear. If truth is quiet, it invites responsibility." The letter was never published. It did not need to be. Across universities, student-led discussion groups formed, not around belief, but around epistemology. How do humans decide what matters? What qualifies as knowledge? What do we do when the universe refuses to dramatize itself? The artifacts at the Israel Museum became a focal point for this shift. Visitors spent long minutes staring at the astrolabe, tracing its markings without understanding them fully. Children asked why, something so important looked so ordinary. Docents gave the same answer. Because it was meant to last. In Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives returned to routine. The telescopes were packed away. The hills were quiet again. But something lingered. Not awe, not disappointment, but attentiveness. People remembered the act of watching together. That memory proved durable. Late one night, Cross reviewed the smallest parchment again. She noticed a line she had previously translated too clinically. "The heavens will not persuade you. They will wait for you." She closed the folder. For the first time since the discovery, Cross felt no urgency to move forward. The watchers had not rushed. Neither should she. The past had spoken. Not loudly, not clearly, but faithfully. And perhaps that was the final lesson. That meaning does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates. Quietly. Across generations. In the months following the convergence, the story began to change shape. What had once dominated headlines as a mystery or controversy slowly receded from public urgency. There were no follow-up signs to sensationalize, no dramatic events to sustain outrage or devotion. And yet, within academic and scientific circles, something irreversible had occurred. The narrative of progress had fractured. At Heidelberg University, new interdisciplinary programs quietly formed. Astronomy students attended history seminars. Archaeologists learned orbital mechanics. Philosophers of science revisited assumptions that had gone unchallenged for centuries. Dr. Evelyn Cross watched this transformation with cautious satisfaction. She refused invitations to speak at conferences that framed the discovery as a turning point of belief. Instead, she accepted those that framed it as a turning point of method. "We assumed knowledge accumulates forward," she told one closed symposium. "The evidence suggests it also survives sideways, through concealment, transmission, and restraint." That restraint became the defining feature of the Watchers. Dr. Aaron Locke published a technical paper outlining the system's redundancy architecture. He avoided historical speculation entirely, focusing instead on design principles, verification cycles, error tolerance, observer bias mitigation. His conclusion was unsettling in its simplicity. "The system anticipates disbelief," Locke wrote. "It was constructed to function even when ignored." The idea resonated far beyond astronomy. Sociologists noted changes in public discourse. Fewer absolutist claims, more conditional language. Phrases like "we don't know yet" appeared with surprising frequency in media commentary. At the Israel Museum, curators resisted pressure to dramatize the artifacts. The astrolabe remained unpolished. The parchments were displayed with minimal annotation. Visitors lingered longer in silence than in explanation. One curator summarized the approach succinctly. "These objects don't want to be explained," she said. "They want to be respected." Father Elias Dimitriou returned to monastic life, but not unchanged. He began teaching a small group of novices astronomy, not as theology, but as discipline. Night after night, they observed the sky without commentary. "Do not interpret," he told them. "Record." The phrase echoed the Watchers' ethos. Meanwhile, Dr. Karim al-Rashid pursued a question that had emerged quietly after the convergence. If the Watchers had tracked planetary motion with such care, they may have noticed anomalies others ignored. Al-Rashid began examining long-term deviations in orbital models, tiny discrepancies dismissed as noise. He found patterns that suggested observational continuity beyond what history acknowledged. Not answers, but questions. Across cultures, ancient sky records were re-examined. Chinese star charts, Islamic observatories, Mayan calendars. Not as isolated achievements, but as fragments of a broader human impulse to watch, to remember. Cross received a handwritten letter one evening, forwarded from a monastery archive. It contained a translation of a marginal note added in the 10th century to the original codex. "We did not understand them," the note read, "but we understood why we should not alter them." Cross folded the letter carefully. The Watchers had never tried to change the world. They had trusted time to do that. And time, it seemed, was finally listening. The year after, the convergence did not announce itself with change. It revealed it slowly. In academic journals, the language softened. Where papers once asserted conclusions, they now described conditions. Where certainty had dominated, probability returned. The influence was subtle, but measurable. Dr. Evelyn Cross noticed it first in peer review. Submissions referenced uncertainty not as weakness, but as structure. Authors framed findings as observations within a system, not endpoints. It was as if an older discipline had quietly reasserted itself, one that valued continuity over closure. At Heidelberg University, Cross supervised a new doctoral program titled Temporal Systems and Knowledge Preservation. It attracted students from physics, archaeology, philosophy, and computer science. None of them asked about belief. They asked about design. "How do you build knowledge that survives neglect?" one student asked during a seminar. Cross answered without hesitation. "You remove urgency. You make it patient." Dr. Aaron Locke experienced the shift differently. Invitations arrived from unexpected places: software engineers, cryptographers, systems theorists. They saw in the Watcher's architecture something familiar: redundancy, error correction, deferred verification. "This is information theory," one engineer told him, "just applied across centuries instead of seconds." Locke began collaborating outside astronomy for the first time in his career. Together, they modeled the Watcher's system as a distributed network: nodes of observation, delayed synchronization, minimal transmission, a system optimized not for speed, but for survival. In Jerusalem, Father Elias Demetriou received a message from a young rabbi studying medieval manuscripts. He had found a passage in an overlooked commentary, dismissed for centuries as mystical speculation. It described those who count the lights, not to summon them, but to remember when they return. The phrasing echoed the parchment too closely to ignore. Demetriou forwarded the text to Cross. Patterns were emerging across cultures, not identical, not coordinated, but resonant. Independent traditions preserving fragments of the same impulse, not doctrine, practice. The Watchers were not a sect. They were a role. Observers assigned not by hierarchy, but by temperament. Those who could watch without intervening, record without embellishing, preserve without owning. Cross realized then why the artifacts had unsettled so many institutions. They resisted control. They offered nothing to command, nothing to enforce, only inheritance. At the Israel Museum, a guest book filled with handwritten notes. Many were simple. I didn't understand it, but I stayed longer than I meant to. I came for answers and left with questions. It made me quieter. Curators noticed visitors returning, bringing others, not to explain, but to share the experience of not knowing together. One evening, Cross reviewed a long-term projection with Locke. It extended centuries beyond the present: future conjunctions, secondary markers, confirmations repeating at predictable intervals. "Someone else will notice," Locke said. "Yes," Cross replied, "if we don't interrupt it." That became her guiding principle. Do not conclude, do not finalize, do not translate patience into doctrine. The Watchers had trusted humanity with time. Now humanity had to decide whether it could return the favor. Years passed. The convergence of March 27, 2026, receded into the long memory of events that did not demand to be remembered, but were not forgotten either. It settled into footnotes, into appendices, into quiet references made without emphasis. That, Dr. Evelyn Cross realized, was precisely its strength. The Watcher's system had entered the archive of human understanding without fanfare. It did not fracture belief systems. It did not reorder institutions. It simply remained, available to those who chose to engage with it carefully. At Heidelberg University, Cross's program expanded beyond its original scope. Students no longer framed research around singular discoveries, but around durational knowledge, systems designed to outlast individuals, ideologies, even languages. One dissertation modeled the Watcher's network as an early form of distributed cognition. Another compared the ephemerides to modern error-correcting codes. None of them attempted to explain why the Watchers existed, only how they worked. Dr. Aaron Locke found himself increasingly distant from public debate. He declined interviews, preferring to publish technical appendices that few read but many cited. His reputation shifted, not as a skeptic or believer, but as something rarer, a witness. In Jerusalem, Father Elias Dimitriou visited the Mount of Olives one last time before returning permanently to monastic life. There were no telescopes now, just the city, layered with centuries of expectation and disappointment. He stood where observers had gathered years earlier and understood something he had missed before. The Watchers had not chosen Jerusalem because it was sacred. They had chosen it because it was remembered. Memory, Dimitriou realized, was the true medium of the system. Not parchment, not bronze, not instruments. Human continuity. At the Israel Museum, the artifacts were rotated periodically to preserve them. Each rotation drew a small crowd, not tourists but returners. People who had seen them once and felt compelled to see them again. The question displayed beside the exhibit never changed. Did this system predict the future, or teach us how to observe it? Visitors wrote responses on small cards. Most did not answer directly. They wrote reflections instead. One read, "I expected certainty. I found patience." Another, "It didn't tell me what to believe. It told me to pay attention." Cross collected these notes occasionally, not for analysis, but as evidence of something difficult to quantify. Impact without instruction. Late one evening, Locke sent Cross a message containing a simple data set. Future conjunctions, projected centuries ahead. Nothing extraordinary, just repetition. "The system continues," he wrote. Cross replied hours later. "So do we." She understood then that the most radical aspect of the Watchers' work was not their knowledge of the heavens, but their trust in those who would come after them. They had not assumed enlightenment. They had assumed continuity. The future, in their view, was not a destination. It was a reader. Time did what it always does. It absorbed the extraordinary into the ordinary. The Watchers' artifacts no longer dominated conversation. They became reference points, quiet coordinates in a larger map of human inquiry. Students cited them in theses. Engineers borrowed their logic. Historians adjusted timelines with cautious footnotes. No one owned the discovery anymore. That, Dr. Evelyn Cross believed, was its final success. Ownership corrodes continuity. The Watchers had avoided it entirely. In a closed session at Heidelberg, Cross presented what would be her last formal lecture on the subject. She spoke without slides, without data projections. The room was filled with scholars who already knew the facts. "What endures here," she said, "is not information. It is posture." She described posture as a way of standing before the unknown, neither submissive nor dominating, attentive, patient. The watchers didn't ask the future to agree with them, Cross continued. They asked it to look. After the lecture, a student asked the question that had hovered for years. Do you think they expected us? Cross smiled slightly. I think they expected someone. That distinction mattered. Dr. Aaron Locke experienced the same realization while reviewing new data from amateur astronomers. Uncoordinated observers across continents had independently recorded a minor alignment predicted by the system, one too subtle for headlines, too precise for chance. They had noticed because they were watching. Locke forwarded the confirmations to Cross with a brief note. The reader is active. In Jerusalem, Father Elias Demetrio wrote his final commentary, not on theology, but on method. It was never published. It circulated hand to hand among a small group of scholars and clerics. In it, he proposed that revelation was never about arrival. It was about transmission. Meaning, he wrote, is not delivered, it is inherited. The watchers had trusted that inheritance would be imperfect and had designed for it anyway. Across museums and universities, a subtle ethic emerged. Curators resisted dramatization. Educators emphasized uncertainty as skill. Scientists spoke openly about the limits of inference. None of this was mandated. It simply spread. One evening, Cross returned again to the Altmühl Valley. The cave had been sealed for preservation. No markers, no plaques, just stone and forest. She stood where the parchment had first caught the light of her flashlight and imagined the person who had placed it there. Not in fear, not in hope of fame, but with confidence that time itself was collaborator enough. As she left, Cross felt no urge to conclude the story. Conclusions, she had learned, were interruptions. The watchers had left space instead. Space for questions. Space for patience. Space for readers yet to come. And perhaps that was the most radical gesture of all. Years later, when the story was told at all, it was told softly. There were no definitive titles for it. No single discipline claimed authority. It lived instead in margins, between astronomy and history, between faith and method, between knowing and waiting. Dr. Evelyn Cross retired quietly from fieldwork, though she never stopped teaching. Her final seminar at Heidelberg was not about the parchment, the astrolabe, or the watchers by name. It was about endurance. What survives, she told her students, is rarely what demands attention. It is what tolerates neglect. She left them with a simple assignment. Choose one system, natural or human, and study how it persists without reinforcement. Most chose rivers. Some chose languages. A few chose stars. Dr. Aaron Locke continued to publish, but only intermittently. His later work focused on long-horizon modeling, systems designed to remain interpretable across cultural and technological shifts. When asked in an interview why he avoided public commentary on the convergence, he answered plainly, because explanation is not the same as understanding. At the Israel Museum, the exhibit plaque remained unchanged. Visitors still paused before the bronze disc, still traced the astrolabe's markings with their eyes, still read the question and failed to answer it directly. Did this system predict the future, or teach us how to observe it? Guides noticed something over time. People spent less time asking what it meant, and more time asking how it was done. The shift was subtle, but consistent. Curiosity replaced conclusion. In monasteries and observatories, in classrooms and on rooftops, people continued to look up, not with expectation, but with practice. They recorded, they compared, they learned to notice small deviations and long returns. The watchers, if they had ever been individuals, had dissolved into a role that anyone could inhabit. Observer, recorder, preserver. On a clear night, many years after the convergence, Cross stood outside her home and watched Jupiter rise. She did not calculate. She did not predict. She simply watched, aware that others, unknown to her, were doing the same. That was enough. She remembered a line from the smallest parchment, one she had never shared publicly. The sky does not change for us. We change for it. The watchers had not offered answers. They had offered time. Time to notice patterns. Time to disagree without erasing. Time to inherit knowledge without mastering it. In the end, nothing had returned. And yet, something had been restored. A posture of attention, a respect for continuity, a willingness to let meaning arrive slowly. The heavens continued their silent work, indifferent to belief, faithful to motion, and beneath them, humanity, no longer rushing quite so fast, learned again how to watch the end.